The air was thick with smoke, the sky painted with the aftermath of battle. The war had raged on for hours, leaving the once proud alien city in ruins. The ground was littered with the bodies of both human and alien soldiers, their blood staining the sand beneath them. Among the wreckage, the figure of Vera, an alien warrior from the Sci-Fi species, lay motionless. Her sharp, glowing skin was now dulled by the deep gashes that marred her body, and her once vibrant blue eyes were clouded with the heavy fog of pain. She had fought bravely, but now, like so many others, she had been left behind, abandoned by her comrades as they retreated. Vera had been one of the fiercest soldiers in the Sci-Fi army, known across the galaxy for her ruthless tactics and unmatched combat skills. But now, as she lay on the cold, desolate ground, those skills meant nothing. The faint sound of approaching footsteps made her heart race. She tried to lift her head, to look for some sign of life, but her vision blurred and the world around her spun. It was over. The human soldiers had won. Just as she was ready to surrender to the dark abyss, the sound of footsteps grew louder. This time, they were different, slow, deliberate. There was no rush, no chaos in them. She could feel the weight of the person approaching her, a presence that didn't belong in this war-torn land. Her instincts screamed for her to fight, but her body was too weak, too broken. She couldn't move. Through her fading consciousness, she saw a figure emerge from the smoke, a human soldier. His face was hard, his eyes tired, but there was something else there, a glimmer of something unexpected. Mercy. He kneeled beside her, his dark, battle-worn uniform contrasting against the pale, alien landscape. His hands were steady as they moved to assess her wounds, his fingers pressing gently against her side, feeling for any signs of life. She tried to lift her arm, to strike at him, to defend herself, but all she could do was tremble. "You're not dying today," the human muttered, his voice gruff but steady, as if the weight of war had never touched him. "Not while I'm here." Vera's heart pounded in her chest, the words barely making sense in her disoriented state. This human, he wasn't here to finish her off as she expected. No, he was here to save her. With a soft hiss, the human pulled something from his belt, a syringe, small and sleek. Without a second thought, he pressed it into her arm, the cold liquid rushing into her veins. Vera's head lolled back onto the ground, her vision swimming as the serum began to work. She could feel the pain in her body slowly dulling, her senses sharpening just a little. It wasn't enough to erase the damage, but it was enough to bring her back from the edge. Vera had always believed humans were nothing but savages, bloodthirsty creatures, weak in mind but strong in force. She had heard the stories, their brutal raids, their unrelenting attacks, the way they left no mercy for the weak. And yet here was one of them, saving her life instead of taking it. A human soldier, her enemy, was now her savior. "What's your name?" Vera rasped, her voice barely a whisper. She couldn't understand it. Why was he helping her? Did he think she would somehow repay him? Did he think that his kindness would somehow turn her to his side? He didn't answer right away, as if he wasn't sure how to respond to such a strange question. "Jake," he said simply, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You're lucky I found you first." Vera's mind was a whirl of confusion and suspicion. She had never known a human to act like this. She had expected him to kill her, just another casualty of war. But he hadn't. Instead, he was keeping her alive, helping her. The very thing she thought was impossible. And that thought alone made her blood run cold. As the minutes passed, Jake worked tirelessly, checking her wounds, ensuring that the medicine he'd given her was taking effect. He didn't speak much. There was a quiet intensity to his every action, his movements quick and precise. Vera wanted to ask him why, to demand answers. But the words never came. She was too weak to argue, too surprised to be angry. For the first time in a long while, she felt vulnerable. "You're not like the others," Vera said eventually, her voice trembling with the strange realization. "Why are you helping me?" The question was simple, but the answer was far more complex. Jake paused, looking down at her with an expression that was almost unreadable. "Because it's my job," he said. "I'm a medic, not a soldier. My job is to save lives, no matter who they belong to." Vera didn't know what to make of this. A medic. In the middle of a war. It didn't make sense. But before she could think about it any longer, a sudden roar of explosions shattered the silence. The war was far from over. Jake quickly checked the sky. More of the Sulphur's forces were closing in. They had to move, and fast. Jake's words rang in her ears. He was a medic, a human, trained to heal, not to fight. Yet there he was, ready to risk his life for hers, as if she were nothing more than another patient to save. He had no idea what kind of creature she was, or what her people were capable of. All he saw was a life in need of saving. And that was enough. The reality of her situation settled in. Vera had been given a second chance, a chance that no one, not even the fiercest warrior, could have expected. She looked at Jake once more, seeing him not as the enemy, but as the one who had saved her life. This human, with all his flaws and his courage, had become her unexpected hero. The battle around them was far from over, but for now, Vera had a new challenge. Understanding why she was still alive, and how this human could change everything she'd ever believed about the people she'd spent her life fighting. Vera's eyes flickered open, her senses returning slowly. The dull ache in her body was still there, but the unbearable pain from before had faded. She tried to move, but her limbs felt like they were made of lead, heavy and uncooperative. As she shifted, she realized she was no longer lying on the cold ground of the battlefield. Instead, she was in a small makeshift shelter, the soft hum of machinery filling the air. She could hear a faint peeping sound, and the rustle of fabric nearby. When she turned her head, she saw him. Jake, the human soldier who had saved her. He was sitting by a table, busy with medical tools, his back turned to her as he focused on preparing something. Vera's mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. She should have been dead by now. Humans didn't help enemies. They killed them. Yet here she was, alive, tended to by the very person she had spent her life fighting against. Her breath caught as she looked at him more closely. His face was tired, lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were sharp, focused on the task at hand. He didn't seem to notice that she was awake yet. Vera wasn't sure what to do. Should she remain silent or confront him? She still couldn't wrap her mind around what had happened. In the midst of the war, in the heart of battle, he had chosen to save her. But why? What did he want from her? The question swirled in her mind, filling her thoughts with doubt. Humans were known for their ruthlessness, their endless thirst for war. But Jake, he was different. She couldn't deny it. The way he had treated her, with care and compassion, was unlike anything she had ever experienced. As she tried to sit up, she felt a wave of dizziness rush over her, and she collapsed back onto the bed. She winced, the familiar sting of pain returning as she pressed a hand to her side. Jake immediately turned around, his quick reflexes kicking in as he noticed her struggle. His eyes softened, but he didn't rush toward her. Instead, he took a few calm steps, assessing her condition. There was no panic in his movements, just a calm, steady determination. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and soothing, like he was talking to a child, yet his tone wasn't condescending. It was just caring. "You're still weak. You need to rest." Vera's eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't treating her like an enemy. He wasn't even treating her like an alien. To him, she was just another person, someone in need of help. It unsettled her, making her question everything she had known about humans. "Why are you doing this?" Vera finally asked, her voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. Her throat felt dry, and the words came out with difficulty. She could feel her pulse quicken as she waited for Jake's answer. Was this some sort of trap? Did he have plans to betray her once she was fully healed? Jake didn't seem surprised by her question. In fact, he almost seemed to expect it. He walked over to a nearby shelf and grabbed a small canteen of water. He offered it to her, waiting for her to take it before he spoke. "Because it's what I was trained to do," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm a medic. My job is to save lives, no matter who they belong to." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Vera's chest tighten. A medic. Vera had heard of them. They were rare among human soldiers, trained not for combat, but for healing. The very idea seemed alien to her, but as she watched Jake, something about his calm demeanor made her believe him. "You're a soldier. You fight." Vera's voice trembled as she tried to piece together his actions. "Why would a soldier risk his life for someone like me? An enemy?" Jake shrugged, though his expression softened. "War's complicated. Not everything's black and white. Some of us don't like fighting, but we do it because we have to. And some of us do it because we believe in something." He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. "I'm just doing my job. Saving lives, no matter who they belong to." Vera's mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. She had been raised to believe that humans were the enemy, that they were nothing more than savage creatures out for destruction. Yet here was one, sitting in front of her, offering her care and compassion. Was this just some sort of tactic? A human trick to manipulate her into lowering her guard? But there was no sign of deception in his eyes. In fact, there was something else there, a quiet sincerity that made her question everything she had ever believed about her enemies. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Vera found herself studying him, trying to understand the man who had saved her life. His dark hair was cut short, and his face was weathered, but there was a gentleness in his eyes that didn't match the hardened exterior of a soldier. He had seen death, that much was clear, but he still held on to something pure, something that made him different from the rest. Vera wanted to ask him more. She wanted to know everything, why he was different, what he truly believed, and why he had helped her. But before she could gather the courage to speak, Jake stood up, his movements fluid and confident. "I need to keep an eye on your wounds," he said, his voice gentle yet firm. "You're going to need more rest before we can move." Vera nodded, her gaze following him as he moved around the room, his presence somehow comforting despite the war that still raged outside. She couldn't explain why, but she trusted him. And that trust, fragile as it was the first crack in the walls she had built around herself for so long. As Jake continued his work, Vera closed her eyes for a moment, trying to make sense of this strange new reality. A human soldier had saved her life, and she was now depending on him for her survival. She had always thought of humans as nothing but enemies. But here, in this small, quiet moment, her world was shifting. And she wasn't sure what it meant yet, but she knew this. Nothing would ever be the same again. As the days passed, Vera's body slowly began to heal under Jake's careful attention. Her wounds were stitched and bandaged, and the searing pain that had once consumed her was now a dull ache she could manage. Despite this, her mind remained unsettled. The war raged on outside their temporary shelter, and every sound that reached her ears was a reminder of the world she had left behind. The sounds of gunfire and explosions echoed through the distance, a constant reminder that her people were fighting for survival, and the humans were doing the same. Vera had been raised to see humans as nothing but enemies. In the beginning, when she had first awoken in Jake's shelter, her mind had been clouded by confusion. But now, as her body recovered, and she spent more time with him, her thoughts were becoming clearer. She was still an enemy to him, but he had saved her life. She had to remind herself of that every day. Jake was kind to her. He treated her like a person, not a threat. He didn't look at her with the hatred or fear that her people often directed at humans. His actions seemed so different from everything she had ever learned about them. and that created a strange, uncomfortable tension between them. She couldn't understand why he was willing to risk his life to save someone like her. She was no hero, no savior, just a soldier like any other. The same kind of soldier that would have killed him if given the chance. It wasn't that she hadn't fought hard for her people. She had. She had been trained since childhood to be an elite soldier, to defend her planet from invaders. But now, here she was, depending on the enemy to keep her alive. She couldn't ignore the irony, nor could she ignore the way her emotions were starting to shift. It was a strange feeling, almost like a slow, creeping betrayal of everything she had ever believed. On the third day, Vera was sitting by the small window in the shelter when she heard something that made her heart skip a beat. The distant hum of a spacecraft. She didn't have to be told to recognize it. Her sharp alien senses detected it immediately. The unmistakable sound of a human fighter ship. Her heart tightened. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot. It was still happening outside these walls. And now, there was a chance that her people were getting closer. Vera quickly stood up, her body still weak, but her instincts kicking in. She stumbled towards Jake, who was sitting at the table, writing something in a small journal. His back was to her, but he didn't need to hear her footsteps to know something was wrong. He had gotten used to her every movement, every glance. "What is it?" he asked, his voice steady as he turned to face her. He could see the panic in her eyes, and that worried him more than anything else. "It's them," Vera said, her voice trembling. "My people. They're coming. I can hear their ships." Jake didn't waste any time. He stood up, his face hardening, and moved to the small equipment corner. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice firm but not unkind. "I need to check the comms. If they're coming, we need to prepare." Vera nodded, her hands shaking as she sank back onto the bed. She wanted to help. She wanted to fight. But her body still wasn't fully healed, and she couldn't risk making herself worse. She had to trust Jake. But that wasn't easy, especially now. Her people were out there, and they would not stop until every last human was dead. Jake was moving quickly around the shelter, checking various screens and pulling up data on the small terminal. His face was tense, his eyes scanning the information. The reality of the situation hit him hard. If her people arrived, it would be dangerous for both of them. They would be forced to pick sides, and he had already made his decision. He had to protect her. But that meant he might have to fight his own people. The silence between them felt heavy as the two of them waited. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, the kind of silence that hinted at a growing storm just beyond the horizon. The weight of what was coming hung over them, and neither of them could escape it. Jake didn't want to fight, but if it came down to it, he wouldn't hesitate. He had made a promise to save her, and he would do everything in his power to keep that promise. "Vera," Jake began, his voice softer now. "You need to understand something. I'm not going to let them hurt you. If they come, I'll do what I have to." Vera met his gaze, her chest tight. "You're willing to kill your own kind to protect me." Jake's expression was grim, but there was a determination in his eyes. "I'm not killing anyone, Vera. I'm protecting you. But if it comes to that, if it's between you and them..." He trailed off, his gaze falling to the floor as if the weight of the decision was too much for him to bear. The tension was unbearable. Every moment that passed felt like an eternity. The noise outside grew louder, and Vera could hear the engines of the ships as they approached. It wouldn't be long now. She could feel the sense of impending doom creeping up on her. Her people would not be merciful. They would do whatever it took to destroy the humans, and she would be forced to choose. Jake continued to monitor the situation, his face hard as he prepared himself for whatever was coming. He knew that the moment her people arrived, there would be no turning back. He would have to protect her. And that meant choosing a side, one that he hadn't fully understood until now. Vera swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't bring herself to trust him completely yet, but there was something about him that made her want to believe in him. He had saved her life, after all. But was that enough? Could she put aside her training, her duty to her people, to trust a human? The war had never been this complicated before. The lines between good and evil were no longer clear. The tension between Vera and Jake was growing. It was impossible to ignore the unease in the air as they both waited in silence, knowing that the moment of truth was approaching. Vera could feel the weight of her people coming closer with every passing second. The deep-rooted loyalty to her race battled with the new emotions that had begun to form, emotions she couldn't explain. But the truth was, the fight inside her was not only against Jake's people, but also against herself. Vera had always been trained to believe that humans were the enemy. They were the invaders, the ones who had brought war to her planet. They were ruthless, merciless, and had no place in the galaxy. Her entire existence had been shaped by this belief. From the day she was born, she had been taught that the human race was a threat to be eliminated, a force of destruction that had no regard for anyone other than themselves. But now, after everything that had happened, Vera found herself questioning everything she had ever known. Jake was a human, but he was nothing like the enemy she had been taught to fear. He had saved her life, taken care of her, and shown her a kindness that she had never expected. It was this kindness that created the internal struggle, the pull between her loyalty to her people and her growing connection to him. There were moments when she looked at him, and for a brief instant, she saw only a person, someone just like her, with hopes and fears, with a heart capable of compassion. But then the reality of her situation hit her again, and the battle began anew. She had to remind herself of who she was, of what she stood for. The humans had caused the destruction of her world, the deaths of her friends and family. Jake might seem different, but he was still one of them. She couldn't let herself be swayed by his actions, by the way he cared for her. She couldn't let him make her forget her duty. Her loyalty to her people came first, no matter what her heart wanted to believe. But the more time she spent with Jake, the harder it became to hold on to those beliefs. She had never seen a human act with so much empathy, so much courage. She had expected to see fear, distrust, and cold-hearted calculations, but instead, Jake showed her kindness without hesitation. The way he had treated her when she was at her weakest, the way he had risked his own life to save hers, it was more than she could have ever imagined from an enemy. And it created a confusion that Vera had never known before. The sound of the ships grew louder, and Vera couldn't ignore the fear that crept into her heart. Her people were close, but so was her choice. She could stay loyal to her race, to the war she had been born into, or she could abandon everything she had been taught and trust Jake, a human. The thought of betraying her people made her stomach turn, but at the same time, the idea of leaving Jake behind, of facing the reality that the kindness he had shown her could be a lie, was almost too much to bear. What if she trusted him, and it all turned out to be a mistake? What if he was just playing her, trying to get inside her head before his people killed her? The pain in her chest intensified. Every time she looked at Jake, she saw not an enemy, but a person who had cared for her when no one else had. She couldn't deny the feelings that had grown within her. Her body felt torn between two sides, her loyalty to her people and her heart's desire to believe that there was goodness in the human race. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape it. Jake, for his part, sensed the turmoil that Vera was experiencing. He could see the way she struggled to reconcile the person she had been trained to be with the person she was becoming. He could see it in her eyes, the confusion, the hurt, but he didn't know how to help her. He didn't know how to make her see that he wasn't the enemy. The weight of her indecision crushed him too. He didn't want to be the one who forced her to choose, but he knew that the choice was coming soon, and it would be a choice that could mean life or death for both of them. He wished that he could take her pain away, that he could show her a world where they didn't have to be enemies. But that was something beyond his control. The war was bigger than both of them. And yet he couldn't help but wish for an outcome that didn't involve fighting or death, a world where he and Vera could stand side by side, and face whatever came together. It was a foolish wish, he knew, but in his heart he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still hope. Vera's mind was spinning. Every argument she had made in her own head felt like it was slowly unraveling. She had been trained to see humans as nothing but animals, monsters to be feared. But Jake had shown her otherwise. It wasn't just the way he had saved her, it was the way he had treated her as an equal, as a person. No human had ever done that before. And she couldn't deny that she had started to care for him. It terrified her. She could still hear the engines of the ships in the distance, the sound of her people growing closer. The battle was coming, and so was her decision. Would she fight for her people, for the race that had given her everything? Or would she betray them, risk it all, and trust the human who had shown her kindness? The battle was brutal, and the enemy forces were relentless. The sky was filled with the sounds of energy blasts, the crackle of weapons discharging, and the screams of those caught in the crossfire. Vera's heart pounded in her chest as she took down one enemy after another, her mind focused on the task at hand. The blood of her people was spilled, but so was the blood of the humans who had fought beside her. The battlefield felt like a living, breathing entity, with every moment more chaotic than the last. She had never seen war like this before. The chaos was overwhelming, but in the midst of it, there was something else, something she hadn't expected. A sense of unity. Jake was there, fighting beside her every step of the way, not as an enemy, but as an ally. Their connection, born from trust and necessity, had become something more. They moved as one, each anticipating the other's moves, protecting one another in ways that transcended words. In the heat of battle, there was no time for doubts, no time for questions. There was only the fight to survive. The enemy forces were beginning to retreat, but not without a final desperate push. As the last wave of soldiers advanced on their position, Vera and Jake knew they had one final chance to end it. The moment of truth had come. They could either fight to the bitter end, or they could use everything they had learned together to turn the tide. With a glance, Vera made the decision. She and Jake would make one last stand, and they would do it together. They rose from their cover, weapons raised, and charged toward the remaining enemies. The final clash was intense, the air crackling with energy as weapons collided, and the sounds of explosions echoed across the battlefield. For a moment, everything seemed to blur, the flashing lights, the noise, the chaos. But as the final blow was struck, everything went quiet. The enemy forces had been defeated. The battlefield was silent, save for the sound of their heavy breathing. Vera and Jake stood in the midst of the wreckage, both covered in dust and blood, but alive. They had done it. They had fought, side by side, and survived. The battle was over, but a new alliance had been born. In the aftermath, as they looked at one another, they realized that they had come to trust each other in ways they never thought possible. This fight was just the beginning, but one thing was certain. Together, they could face anything. And their bond, forged in the heat of battle, would carry them forward into whatever challenges lay ahead. The silence that followed the final clash felt surreal. Vera and Jake stood side by side, battered but alive, surveying the battlefield. The once thriving landscape now lay in ruins, filled with the remnants of the enemy forces and the dust of destruction. The air was heavy, still charged with the remnants of energy blasts and the distant echoes of battle. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something more to happen. Jake's heart was still racing as he glanced at Vera. She looked different now, her face set with a newfound strength. The coldness in her eyes had faded, replaced by something softer, something more human. It was as though the fight had transformed her, and in some strange way, it had done the same for him. He could still hardly believe how far they had come. From the moment they had met, enemies on opposite sides of an intergalactic war, to this very moment where they had fought together as allies. They had survived against impossible odds and the trust that had been built between them was something neither of them had ever expected. Vera had gone from seeing him as nothing more than a human soldier to understanding him as a person, and he had learned that not all aliens were enemies. Some were just like him, lost, searching for meaning, and capable of change. But the war was far from over. The enemy forces might have been defeated here, but the greater conflict still raged on across the stars. Vera knew that even though they had won this battle, the war was far from over. Her people were still out there, and there were more battles to fight, more alliances to build. But now she had something she hadn't had before, a reason to fight, a purpose beyond the orders she had been given. Looking at Jake, she knew that he had given her that purpose. He had shown her that strength came not only from weapons and power, but from the heart. And it was that strength, the strength they had both discovered within themselves, that would carry them forward. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Jake asked, his voice steady, but with a trace of uncertainty. Vera nodded, her expression firm. "I don't know what's coming next, but I know we'll face it together."